Thank you everyone for joining us today. These are part of the Sea Change webinars I've been organizing as part of the Physics and Astronomy Sea Change project. I will put, after David begins, I will put the link to our for more information on our project. And these are just the webinars to get people thinking about cool stuff they can do for their classrooms to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. And today I'm really happy and excited to hear what Dr. David Kung has to say about math and social justice with some lessons for physics. David, take it over.
Thanks, Alexis. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, and I'm thrilled to see so many people here. I'm a mathematician. All of my degrees from Madison were in mathematics, but my undergraduate, I actually came one credit away from a physics degree. So I have a lot of affinity for the physics world, and so I'm really thrilled to come back there a little bit and get to talk to you all. So I wanted to talk about math and social justice, and I want us to think. I hope you can think a little bit about what this means for physics. I have a fair number of hats, including I teach at St. Mary's College in Maryland, but I work for TIPSE, Transforming Post-Secondary Education in Math, and I also work for the MAA, the Mathematical Association of America. But today, I'm really only speaking for myself, so please don't attribute anything I say to any of those organizations. We're going to do a little workshop in two acts. We're going to talk about social justice in mathematics first, and then the second half, we're going to talk about curricular issues, mathematics for social justice. And in both cases, I hope we figure out what these things mean for physics. And I invite you to use both the chat to talk with each other. And if you have questions, you can pop them in the Q&A. I have both of those up. And Alexis agreed to read any that come up. So I look forward to your questions. I want you first to imagine that you're teaching and it's your first day of a class, maybe mechanics or something, and we're in person. And the students are wandering in, and 5 minutes later, as a new student walks in, sort of after class has already started. So you're already in the middle of class, and the student walks in. And the question I want you to think about is where does that student sit? Where in your, I don't know what your classrooms look like, but you can think about, in any sort of classroom, where do you think that student would sit? And actually, it's sort of a multi-part question. Where do you think that student would sit if there were any of these types of people? Because most of us understand that, like, there are sort of social pressures that work differently on different people, and different people have different personalities and different backgrounds. That would actually get different people to take different places. Yeah, feel free to jump in if you have a strong idea about where somebody would sit. Go ahead and type it in the chat room. I think when I've talked about this question with a bunch of mathematicians, the strongest reaction I usually get is to the 35-year-old returning student. And what people usually say about returning students is, that student, they might have had childcare issues this morning, whatever it is, but they know why they're in college. They know what they need to get out of it, and they're going to take it. And they are much more likely to sit right in front, right? And so they're much more likely to sit right in front. And Jacqueline, I totally agree. Like, we're making assumptions, but what the point here isn't that we know where any one of these people would sit. But the point is that sort of we have this sense that it's different for different people, and it's different depending on who they are, based on their own identities, and based on all of that, and that there are patterns, and they may or may not, and people may or may not fall into those patterns, but it's a different question for different people. And the point here for me is that equal treatment of students is not the same thing as equal experience for students. The experience of walking in late is different for different people. Where they would sit is different from different people. Whether or not they were willing to make a little ruckus and get to their normal seat in the front is different for different people. But this idea applies to everything we do in the classroom, that equal treatment is not fair. I mean, it's the difference between equity and equality, right? And this was really, this really hit home to me. At St. Mary's, when you go through the tenure process, they give all of your students these long forms to fill out. There are these narrative evaluations. And one of the questions on the narrative evals is, does this professor, do you ever see this professor treat people differently based on race, gender? They have a long list of things. And when you read people's, when you're on a tenure committee and you read all of these evaluations, this is the most boring question to read because they all say about the same thing. They say, like, oh, I've never seen this professor discriminate. I can't imagine, her doing anything like that. He's really fair and all this. But the most interesting response I've ever read was somebody who wrote this. He doesn't treat his students equally. He treats them fairly. This is an anonymous student on an evaluation, right? And I think that should be the main goal of education, especially public education, is equal opportunity. So we make sure people have a real opportunity to participate and to succeed in our courses. And that's certainly not the case. That's not what's happening now. And I wanted to go through some statistics. Some of these might be old to you, but I just updated these to get us through 2018. These are all from the NSF, the National Science Foundation, keeps these statistics. Let's talk about women first. So here are undergraduate degrees given to women by discipline. And so these are all fields. And if you see way back here, 50% is right here. And so back since sometime in the mid 80s, more women than men have gotten undergraduate degrees. And so that's where we crossed the 50% mark. And now we're somewhere around 58%, I believe, is where we're at recently. So 58% of undergraduate degrees overall are given to women. And again, an important point here is all these statistics I'm using are using, official categories where, among other things, they consider gender a binary, which we now know is not the case at all. And we don't have good data on queer, on intersex, on non-binary people. And there's a similar comment to be made about race in a few minutes. It's the categories based on race. But we can break this out into different disciplines. And here we see biology and chemistry. And so biology is the only STEM field where women are overrepresented. And chemistry, we peaked over the 50% mark. So I want you all to guess, maybe you know this. So the last date here is 2018. So I want you to type in the chat room, in the chat box, but I want you to not hit return until we're all ready. So if you could type in the chat room, what do you think the percent of physics degrees going to women, undergraduate degrees going to women, what do you think the percent of those are given to women? Of all physics degrees, undergraduate, what percent went to women in 2018? I'll show you the curve in a second. I'll give you like 15 more seconds to make your guess. 2018, all physics degrees, what percent went to women? All right, everybody's jumping the gun. Go ahead and hit return. Something lower than chemistry. Is that the standard? Yeah, we have guesses all over the place. Interesting. So everything, what's the low? I think I see 10 all the way up to 40 or something. Here we go. Here's not just the number, but here's the curve. It's in purple. It's hidden a little bit back down there, but it's around 20%. There's 3 fields in the STEM fields where the percentage of degrees given to women is as low as 20%, and it is computer science, physics, and engineering. There's actually one more department on campus, on your campus, where chances are the percentage is that low, but it's not a STEM field. Anybody have a guess? Econ is a little higher. There you go, philosophy. Yeah, econ is higher. Bo, you guessed econ. It's a little bit higher. Here's the last one. The last STEM field is I put on here is math. Somebody asked about that. Math is just north of 40%. We're usually at 42, 43%. One of the things about math is if you look at the population of students getting undergraduate degrees in mathematics, many of them are heading off to be teachers. And if you look at the teachers, they tend to be are much more likely to be women. They tend to skew women toward women considerably. And what that means is the rest of, if you're looking at, for instance, math majors who are going off to maybe study in graduate school, that is much more, it's a much lower percentage of those are women than this 43% would suggest. So that's the state with women in STEM fields. Let's look at minorities. Again, there's a disclaimer here. These are official categories. that are used by the US government. Race, we all know, is a social construct, but we still fill out bubble forms. And at least now we can fill in bubble forms with more than one, but here we go. So these are undergraduate degrees in the US given to underrepresented minorities. I'm not a big fan of the term underrepresented minorities. I'm much more of a fan. We can talk about this a little bit more later. Like the underrepresented minority sort of puts the emphasis on them, like they need to just show up and represent. I'm a much bigger fan of talking about people from groups that historically we have not supported, sort of taking responsibility for our part of that. But if you look at all STEM degrees, at all undergraduate degrees to US citizens and permanent residents, the most recent numbers we have are about 23% went to underrepresented minorities, and that includes Black, African-American, it includes Hispanic, they use Hispanic, not Latinx, and it includes Native American. And I think there were a couple of years in here where they included some Southeast Asians and then they took them back out. NSF data are a little tricky because of things like that. But the overall trend is really clear. Here we go by field. There's biology and chemistry lagging just a little bit behind the field. Go ahead again. Let's try to do this together. So type in the chat, but do not hit return until I tell you. And the question is, what percentage of physics degrees go to underrepresented students, Black, Latinx, Native American students? Do not hit return, just type the number you think. What percentage of all physics degrees in 2018 went to students from underrepresented groups? All right, go ahead and hit return. I think I saw everything from like a low of 5 to 20. Nice work in holding yourself back. There we go, everything from 5 to 20. Here you go. There's physics, right around 14% with impressive increases most recently in the last 10 years or so. And so we're looking at 14% of those. And if you look at this, and so I'll put mathematics on there as well. We come in, it looks like physics just passed mathematics in the last couple of years. And let's look at this. So this is what it overall looks like. But if you look at the overall US population, people who identify as Black or Hispanic constituted in 2018 about 31, almost 32% of the population. And so in terms of representation, we're doing pretty poorly. And I thought about this and I was talking to some folks. Yeah. And so Ed, that's exactly the right question. So, what about the 18 to 25 age group, right? Because that's the people, at least at my school, a vast majority of our students are in that age group. And that's true nationwide as well. And so I looked up that information. They didn't have 18 to 25, but I pulled 20 to 24 and it's up to 37.2%. So Ed, thank you for teeing up that additional statistic. So 37% of the college age population comes from those groups. And in math and physics, we're down around 13, 14% of our majors are coming from those groups. I have one more point to make about this. If you dig further into the data, and I couldn't put all the data together to get a nice curve, but if you look at the data, at least in mathematics, historically Black colleges, HBCUs, are producing or way overproducing the Black math majors, which means the rest of us at primarily white institutions are doing even worse than this 12 or 13% would suggest. So we're not doing what we need to in terms of diversifying the field, in terms of making sure that we have the equal opportunity that we all want. This is for mathematics. My guess is that you would see similar things in physics. Somebody also commented that that we're doing a lot better with Hispanic, with Latinx populations than we are with Black populations. That's what we see in mathematics. So these are the underrepresented minority groups, and I'm going to split them out by race. But again, just for if we had representation, the goal is equal opportunity, not necessarily equal representation, but getting closer to equal representation would be some indication that we were getting closer to equal opportunity. Again, we should be aiming for something in 37%, and we're something closer to 12 or 13. But if you split this out, there's the Black non-Hispanic group in the orange color, and then in green we have the Hispanic group. And if you pull those out, in terms of representation, 15.1%, and this is again the college age. This is 20 to 24. 15.1% of college age are identify as Black, non-Hispanic, and 22% identify as Hispanic. And you can see that we've done much better in the recent years with Hispanics. And that is, my guess is that you would see a similar thing if you pulled data from physics. Let's look at the PhD level here. Let's look at gender. So women in academia here are the percentage of doctoral recipients that were that identified as female by field. Again, you have all fields here. It is less than 50% of all doctorates go to women, even though at the undergraduate level they have closer to 60%. Biology, women are overrepresented. And then chemistry is science and engineering overall. Here's chemistry. And then down again, it is computer science, physics, and engineering down just around 20%. So, I mean, there's like a slight positive in here that, you know, the percentage of undergrads getting of undergraduate physics majors who are women is around 20%. And there doesn't appear to be a ton of attrition between there and PhDs. You know, people, at least on that level, seem to be about equally likely. There isn't additional leakage from the pipeline. We can look at minorities getting PhDs, and here are the curves there. And again, you know, this, because the numbers are so small, you see a lot more variability in these curves. But here we go, physics, and it's somewhere between 4.5%, right around 4.5% of physics PhDs were coming from these groups. And remember, you know, these underrepresented groups should be significantly higher here, 37%, if we wanted to get to, you know, to representation. So in general, when I look at these sorts of data and I look at the studies, what I see is that we lose women and BIPOC students in math and science at pretty much every level, right? And there are some exceptions, but it's pretty much every level from middle school through professorships. And you can look at that all the way to, you know, who's getting tenure track jobs at you know, the most well-regarded of institutions. And that's true even when you control for preparation and motivation. And this, in some sense, is sort of the basis of why we need something like sea change. But I think it's so important for us to admit that the problem isn't the students and it's really us. And when I think about this, like understanding that the problem is us and not them, like I really am compelled by the work of Uri Treisman. So Uri Treisman was studying students in the 70s. He was studying the first groups of mathematics students who were integrated at Berkeley in the 70s. And so so he had a big question, like, why were the Black students, especially at Berkeley, failing calculus? So that was his big question. This is in the 70s, this is Berkeley. And he went around to the faculty at Berkeley and asked them, you know, like, why do you think, he showed them the data, like, why do you think our Black students are failing so badly? And I want you to take a second in the chat room, like, what do you think they said? What do you think their answers were in the 70s? Go ahead, and whenever you're ready, whenever you have an idea, just go ahead and hit enter. Professors in the 70s in Berkeley looking at why Black students were failing out of calculus in such high numbers. What do you think there? Poor preparation. They're not good at math. They come from bad schools. They can't learn well. They're not prepared in so many ways. The teachers didn't look like them. Ayana, that's an interesting point. Jacqueline, you don't have a whole lot of faith in 1970s physics or, you know, STEM faculty at Berkeley. Minority students are less capable. Perceived relevance. Yeah. So here are the common guesses when he talked to faculty there. Poor preparation. That was one of the most common. Lack of motivation. I'm not sure if I didn't know. I think somebody said something close to that. Lack of family support came up a lot. And socioeconomic forces. That was another, you know, another big point. What he found when he actually interviewed all of these students is that those guesses were all wrong, and those guesses were sort of about them, right? And none of those guesses were sort of about us collectively, and I mean them sort of in a collective sense, not them as individuals, but you know, them, right? It was never nobody pointed and said like, oh, we're doing something wrong. But there's actually one exception to that. So there was a biology professor who's sort of known, you know, in that community as sort of a bell curve kind of academic. So bell curve was a book that came out in the 90s, I think. And it was all about, he was making the claim that whites and Asians were simply sort of had genetic superiority over other groups. And so this person was in that camp. And so when Uri Treisman talked to this person looked at the data and said this really sort of amazing thing, said, you know, I believe that the Black students should be, given their native abilities, failing out in higher numbers, but I don't think they should be doing this bad. Clearly, we're doing something wrong. So the irony of the person widely considered to be the racist around, that person was the only one who sort of said, like, oh, I think we might have some culpability, we might be responsible for this partly, right? And that's, to me, this is the big take-home message, that we need to admit that the problem is about us, right? And it's something that we need to take responsibility for and move forward on. So Treisman's observations helped him develop what he called emerging scholars programs in calculus, and these have been replicated in lots of places. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But when he observed the successful Chinese American students at Berkeley at the time, they worked alone and they got stuck, but they studied together and they helped each other. And one of the ways that I think about this is that they were forming social bonds that really intersected with their academic interests. And so their social support network was supporting their interests in STEM fields. And in contrast, the unsuccessful Black students, they were highly motivated. They had solid preparation. The Black students, the first Black students at Berkeley were the kids of doctors and lawyers. They largely went to very white high schools. They had great preparation. They had a lot of motivation, a lot of support from their families, but they were still failing out. They had all that family support. They worked alone, but then they did not have the sort of support network needed to succeed. They were they had friends. They had an elaborate social network, but it's that their social network was separate from their interests in STEM education, right? And so when things got hard, and things got hard for everybody, when things got hard, they didn't have a social network that was supporting them in persevering in their STEM interests. And that was the huge difference. So Treisman's idea in the emerging scholars was to put students in positions where they were challenged, right? If it's not about them having sort of difficulties in that sense, then remediation is not the right remedy for that. So they still have challenging questions. They were building social support networks that were supporting their interests in math, where they got the good stuff. That's one of the ways Uri likes to talk about it. And in some cases, you can imagine where the good stuff is saved. In some campuses, it's in the fraternities and sororities, like they have long lists of exam problems going back. In some cases, it's a social support network that tells you, oh, watch out for this question. They're going to get you on this question on the exam, something like that. But giving students the opportunity to tackle the hard questions when when the stakes are not so high. The workshop model he built was amazingly successful. It involves students sort of 4 to 6 hours going to special workshops that were intentionally multiracial, multicultural. They work on challenging problems collaboratively. They have social events to sort of build those social networks that other students were getting in other ways, and helped by a graduate student. And I served as a graduate student at University of Wisconsin when they started an emerging scholars program. And I will say that this original model was about Black students at Berkeley, but a similar model has been taken to lots of different places, and in different places it's different populations that you find that the statistics can tell you who you're not really doing well for. And at the University of Wisconsin, one of the groups of students were that historically had really failed out of STEM fields badly, were white students from really small schools. There are a lot of small towns in Wisconsin where they're graduating, 30 people in a class, and those students coming to the University of Wisconsin of 42,000 students were just getting lost. And so the Emerging Scholars Program there served underrepresented racial minorities as well as white students from small communities. And it's always different in different places. If you look at emerging scholars type programs around the country, what you see is higher grades. You see, whether you compare it to historical trends or with other students who are not in those classes, or with students who turn down emerging scholars, you see lower dropout rates. You see higher retention in STEM majors. You see higher retention to a college degree, and you end up seeing a lot more minority math majors. And it works for many different underrepresented groups, as I said a minute ago. at St. Mary's College of Maryland, where I teach. It's a small liberal arts college, around 1,600 students. That's gone up and down a little bit. Back in the fall of 2003, we had 10 Black students start Calc 1. We had 5 drop, 2 Ds, 2 Ds and 3 Cs. And when we looked at those data, that was simply not acceptable to us. The goals for us were to get closer to equal opportunity. And what these numbers were suggesting is we were taking students into the college and saying to them, welcome to St. Mary's, but really a huge number of our majors are not open to you, right? Because we have not put in the support structures necessary to make sure that you can have a good experience in calculus. We had no African-American or Latinx math majors. If you look now, and I'm thinking here is the last 5 to 10 years, we have over half of our Black and Latinx students get Bs or better. We have at least a couple of math majors every year from these groups. 2 of our students have gone on to get master's degrees, and 2 more have gone on to get doctorates in mathematics. And this is all because of some of the work that we've done, including these emerging scholars classes. We now have ESPs, emerging scholars. We exported these to a lot of different STEM fields. The major numbers in math, computer science, and physics are all above the national average, even for liberal arts colleges. We've done a lot of work. Of course, I'm glossing over a lot of the details. We've done a lot of work, and I think Josh Grossman is on here somewhere. Alexis, if we could let Josh chime in here and say a few words about the other work that he's done in physics at St. Mary's, that would be nice. We did get Navigator scholarships. We got the NSF money from an STEM grant, and we have summer support for a lot of research on campus that targets especially minority, first generation, and female students. Josh, you want to add something to what's been going on in physics?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. So yeah, we took a lot of cues from stuff that we learned from Dave, but also from various workshops from AAPT and APS. So one of the first things we did was implement one of these emerging scholars programs, and we saw over 90% retention for students who completed the ESP versus about 76% for students who didn't. So it's a very marked impact. We've also done a lot within a lot of the classes in our we've benefited from working with Angela Johnson in our educational studies department. You may have seen her published in the physics teacher in other areas. She did basically ethnographic studies of our department, of the math and computer science department, has published on them. And we used information from that to change some of our practices. We, everything from redefining, making sure that we're defining success as what the students are seeking, not what the professors define it to be, and values affirmation exercises. We have discussions on diversity, inclusion, and equity in all of our classes. But we have a workshop where we, in our first semester physics majors courses, where students learn the languages and the terminology so that we all know what everyone is talking about when we identify issues. We emphasize teamwork and the skills for students to provide feedback to each other on teamwork, and set the goals being inclusiveness and success as a team, and not just being the first person to get the right answer. And I could go on, but I don't want to cut into Dave's time.
Thanks, Josh. And I think if I'm honest about this, I think a lot of our early efforts on the DEI front are really more about more about assimilation than sort of the more just versions of what I now think about when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think the physics department, which was, when I first got to St. Mary's 20 years ago, way behind the curve, has since far surpassed what we're doing in mathematics. So it's great to hear some of the things that they've done as well. these are the lessons that I've taken from this, and I hope that you can learn something for physics. And a lot of this is echoed in sea change documents and all the processes that sea change is doing. But I think key in this is taking responsibility that the problem is us, and sort of going from there. Providing support, helping all students. I think my takeaway lesson from Uri Treisman's work is all about the power of social networks and the power of social support networks to help students succeed in places they want to succeed. And to sort of move from a deficit model of students to an asset model with the goal of getting a little bit closer to fair. So I promised you a workshop in 2 acts. I think here's the end of Act 1. Alexis, I didn't even warn you that you had a part in this, but if there are any questions, we can stop and take some now. The second half of this goes in a very different direction. If not, we have an intermission here with Ellie, who's 9 years old. But I'm going to give you a good 20 seconds to post any questions. You can do it in chat or in Q&A, either way. Dead air. Dead air is always a little bit uncomfortable, but I think that's about 20 seconds. AIP Team Up Project. I don't know the AIP Team Up Project. That's great. Bo, I'd love to learn more. Were there barriers? Jacqueline, I'm going to guess, were barriers identified to what would prevent students from engaging in these? I think by these you mean things like emerging scholars. I think it's really careful. I think we have to be really careful when we're inviting students into workshops like this. One of the things that happens is students don't want to be pigeonholed into programs that are seen as remedial. I think the sort of psychological impact of being a high achieving student, and many of our students at St. Mary's come from some schools in the Baltimore and DC area that are really underfunded. They have not had great opportunities, but they have succeeded very well in those schools. And the sort of psychological impact of having succeeded in high school, doing really well, and then getting to college and being told, oh, we have this remedial program for you, whether it's explicitly or just implicitly, is really damaging psychologically. And so we work really hard to make sure that all of the programs we run are really pitched as honors programs. These are hard programs. We do hard problems with students, right? And they succeed. We also, we've been really clear about not having any programs that are exclusively for minorities. We think that what we feel like is that we really need a critical mass of students of color so that people feel sort of comfortable bringing their whole selves to the table in these courses. And so that's what we're trying for. Lux, and we got a couple of questions about about earlier than the university level. Certainly there's important work going on at those levels. I would point to the Dana Center down at Texas, which is where Uri is. They're doing really interesting work at the high school level, especially. They don't get down to the 4th grade work, but I would love to hear and learn more about that. For now, I'm going to rush through a little bit of the second half. I want to talk about math for social justice, and I want to get at it with a sort of an oblique entry. Here's a question I love to work with students. So imagine that you're working at a hospital and there's an annual report, and the administrator's up in front giving their annual report, and they say, one of our goals was to get people out of the hospital more quickly, and we've been doing great. 90% of patients who spent the night checked out within a week, right? And but the nurses sort of are talking him back, and one of the nurses says, that can't be, because 80% of the patients who stayed last night have been here for over a year. So these seem really contradictory. My question for you is, can they both be right? Right? Is it possible for both of these to be right? And I just want you to think about this for a little bit while I talk. Is it possible both that 80% of the patients who stayed on a particular night are long-term patients, but 90% of the patients who spent the night were checked out within a week? Now, it may not take you that long to do sort of thinking, yeah, you could do that, right? And so if you imagine just a hospital with 10 beds, you could just cycle people through those last two beds. And so at any one time, 80% of the people in your hospital are long-term people, but over the course of a full year, most of the people could cycle through these last two beds. And so both of those statistics could be true, right? So both of those can be right. The thing is that similar statistics hold for people who are on welfare, who are on unemployment, who are without insurance. There's a lot of indications, a lot of places where statistics like this can be used in either direction. And the agenda that you bring to the table helps determine the statistics you use. And certainly the statistics we hear come out of the agenda of the people feeding this to us. The social statistics, the social science lingo, they said the stock and the flow. And if you look at something like insurance, those can be as different as like 46% are in the stock. What percentage have been the sort of long-term folks? But any one, the 21%, right, of the people in a particular month will be out of insurance for a full year. Those statistics make very different points, and it's based on people's, the agenda that they're bringing. This is what I want to talk about, and I want to talk more about questions like this and ways in which I've been teaching math for social justice here at St. Mary's. And I want to get to the end and talk about what it means for physics. So here's what, I want to think of our students as citizens, not in sort of the limited legal sense of the term citizen, but in the sense of like citizens of, everybody's a citizen of the community that they're in, a citizen of the world. And these are the sorts of mathematics knowledge that I hope our students come out with, our future citizens, right? I want them to understand like what it means for something to be correlated and what it means for it to, what it doesn't mean, right? So the correlation coefficient of 0.86 is absurdly high when you're thinking of sort of statistics out in the wild. But I also want them to understand that that correlation doesn't imply causation, that they need a whole lot of other science in order to understand the causation. This is what we give them, at least in math classes. Instead, we give them these sorts of these questions, which may be kind of fun to those of us who are already lovers of these fields, but these are not the questions that I'm really hoping our future citizens can answer. Here's one of my favorite examples. It comes from 2008, Obama versus McCain, and Senator McCain said that Obama's tax will increase taxes on 50% of small business revenue, right? And he went on to say, wow, that would be bad for jobs. And Obama came back and said, most small businesses don't make more than $250,000 a year. They won't be affected at all. 98% of small businesses make less than that, right? And it didn't take me too long to think through those are not contradictory, right? That 2% of the small businesses can be making half of the small business revenue, right? So those are not contradictory at all. And I remember like watching this live and thinking, oh, that's kind of a cute little thing. And I had like a little smug grin on my face. That's a cute little math problem that I just solved really quickly. Like I lost that smug grin when I realized I had been teaching college students for like 15 years at that point, and never once, not one time, had I taught a student to do that sort of mathematical thinking. Like this is the mathematics that you needed in that moment to understand our national dialogue and make an intelligent choice based on the information and not based on like who you wanted to have a beer with. And I had never once taught a student to do that sort of thinking. Instead, we give them problems like these, right, where we're doing very detailed algebraic manipulations. We give them applications. When we talk about applications, this is my favorite. It's like the use of discriminant. Like if I'm ever looking at a high school algebra book, I'll always like look at their description of a discriminant and what their application of it is, right? Here's the modeling the government payroll by this quadratic that opens upward. And we're supposed to use the discriminant to show that the payroll will reach $80 billion at some point in the future. Like it's a parabola opening upward and we're supposed to use the discriminant to figure that out. I just thought that was so absurd. We tend to, in the math world, we tend to treat students sort of as if they're all going to be STEM majors, or as if they're going to be like future consumers. That's like the important job that they're going to have in the future. We can and we must do better than that. Especially, we can think of our students as future citizens, and I want to talk about how different people have done different things. So Rob Root at Lafayette College teaches a first-year seminar that as sort of a service learning course in mathematics. And he has students working in schools with middle school students. He has them reading Bob Moses's What the Numbers Say, the Algebra Project. Bob Moses was a civil rights leader who was down in Mississippi registering voters back in the 50s and 60s. And he now sees mathematics as a civil rights issue. My friend Lily Kajavi out in LA got her hands on an amazing data set, LAPD traffic stops, where each traffic stop has like race, gender information, how many people were in the car, whether or not they were asked if they could search the car, all of these things. And she runs a statistics class that's essentially just asking the question, are the cops racist? It's an incredibly motivating question. I mean, she's at a Hispanic serving institution in LA. There's a great article related called "Driving While Black in the City of Angels." Really interesting look at how you can teach math for social justice in a statistics setting using real data. Tom Pfaff at Ithaca College has done great work in sustainability, as has Victor Danet, who's at Bryn Mawr. They both teach classes where where they're looking at real data and trying to get students out there in the communities and looking at issues that affect them and that affect their communities, and using mathematics, and in fact learning mathematics along the way. There's lots of other places. The Dana Center and Carnegie have been looking at ways to replace algebra with stats or quantitative reasoning as a requirement. It turns out that the algebra requirement was a huge impediment to people getting 2-year degrees at community colleges. The Launch Years project is a more recent thing at the Dana Center that's all concentrating on this. There's lots of other efforts going on. I don't claim to know all of them, but there's an MAA notes volume. MAA is the Mathematical Association of America. It's a notes volume on math and social justice. There's a great course that some of you might have seen called "Calling Bullshit" at University of Washington. That is it's I think run by a biologist and a psychologist originally, but a really good look at understanding mathematics and understanding data through a lens of trying to make the world a better place. So when I sat down to revamp my course, so my course it's a survey of math course. It's for non-STEM majors. It's the last, probably the last math course they'll ever take. I sat down to figure out like what is really important. And in fact, what I sat down with was a single question, like what mathematics do I hope the person next to me in the voting booth understands? What is that mathematics? Because let's talk about that. And a lot of that mathematics, it turns out, is stuff that they probably have covered earlier in their careers, but maybe not from the perspective of using it to understand the world. Here's the list of math topics that I came up with. We talk about large numbers and estimating things. We have ways of understanding what does it mean that Congress just passed $1.9 trillion in COVID relief? Like, how do you make sense of 1.9 trillion? We talk a lot about percentages and how they're used and how they're spun from different groups. We do fun activities, like I'll give them a data set and then ask them to write 2 different press releases, one from one perspective and one from a different perspective, to give them a sense of how you can take statistics and spin them in different directions. Some of this is different every time I teach this. In 2009, healthcare was a big discussion, and so we talked a lot about healthcare. We talked about the mathematics of insurance. That got us talking about probability and to what extent you can predict how much you're going to have to spend on healthcare. We talk a lot about surveys and voting. We do a lot of reading the news and trying to understand the mathematics underlying all of these. And so we're heading toward the end of this, but I really have a big question for you. What physics do you want the person next to you in the voting booth to understand? I'm going to give you a minute to think about this. And I want you, like, when you have something that you want people to understand, go ahead and type it in the chat room. Like, what physics, what physics concepts, what key ideas do you hope not the people who are physics majors, but do you hope people who go to the voting booth, who are in charge of our democracy, who are in charge of our civic organizations, because those people are probably not sitting in your quantum class, but those people are more likely sitting in your intro physics class. What physics ideas do you hope people understand? The climate apocalypse, the fact that the Earth is round, oblate sphere. Yeah, basic thermodynamics. I think it's really interesting. Yeah. The extent to which basic thermodynamics helps us understand the world, conservation laws, like what it means to have a conservation law. Oh, Timothy French with the back of envelope problem solving, like solving Fermi problems to make estimates. Josh and I have a colleague who loves to do Fermi problems with his physics students. Some understanding of what the universe consists of. Sujata, thanks for that. Natural phenomenon. Yeah. Scientific consensus, like what it means. Like I think there, you know, I've some of the reading I've done this from physicists is like, just what does it mean to have a theory, right? What does a scientific theory mean? Like what does it mean to get scientific consensus on something? And Katerina, evidence versus opinion. I think these are all great ideas. And so I think these are sort of the important questions. Like when we think of our students, I think maybe this is what I want to close with, and then we can have a conversation for those of you who can stick around. But we tend to think of our students as you know, future STEM people, future physicists, future mathematicians. And what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about courses like this is thinking of my students as future citizens. Of course, many of them are already citizens of this country, many of them aren't, but future people on whom upon whom sort of the challenges of the next generation are going to fall, and it'll be it'll be up to them to solve these things. And I mean solve them as like the people on the ground. A lot of scientists will do that, but also people who are making decisions in terms of voting, right? And so if we think of our students in those terms, what would our curricula look like? What would our classrooms look like? What would we ask them to do? So I have a ton more slides about all of this, but I think I want to jump to the end. Like, to me, the teaching when I teach math for social justice, you know, I'm trying to tie math together with lots of other subjects. I'm trying to create more educated citizens. I hope that I'm sparking a lot of critical thinking, and I hope that they find it an engaging, interesting experience. I hope that I leave them with sort of a last math class that opens their eyes to how math can be used and gives them tools to help do that. So so that's the end. So thank you for your time. And Alexis, thanks again for the invitation. And if people have other questions, I would love to hear your other questions, or you can type them in Q&A. I would love to get a dialogue going of sorts. If you have anything to, if you want to shoot me a note, there's my email address. You can find me on Twitter at DTKung. And thanks for your time.
Thank you, Dave. This was a really good talk. You got squeezed a lot in a short period of time. Lots to think about.
Yeah. I love the list you all are coming up with for physics concepts. I know that it must be 20 years ago, somebody put out a book called Physicists for Presidents, or Physics for Presidents. They're sort of like, you know, if you're going to be president, here's the physics that you kind of need to understand. I find it really fascinating that I think when I think about math for responsible citizenship, I don't know that that's any different from the math I would hope a president knows, but my guess is the physics is different. There's all this physics related to you know, to the defense industry that I think that, so I think that those maybe are very different, physics for presidents versus physics for citizens. But I would love to hear more opinions on that from you all.
We're open for questions, so feel free to type stuff into the chat or the Q&A.
Dancing with the Woo Masters. That sounds interesting. Ah, yeah. So the inherent biases, right? There's this sort of understanding. There's a huge debate going on in the math world about, you know, is math sort of culture free or something? Like, does 2 + 2 always equal 4, or is that itself a cultural statement? And I think mathematicians, especially, maybe even more so than physicists, like to see ourselves as sort of pure and some sort of Platonic ideal as in our in the things that we study. And people are really pushing back on that right now about, you know, it may be that there is some sort of abstract 2 + 2 = 4, but even when we communicate that, you know, we're communicating that in a language within a culture by people who are inherently biased. And we have to understand that, and that not understanding that, not seeing that, is sort of part of what white supremacy is. So it's an interesting debate going on that I think is one that we're going to have to come to grips with if we really want to make the progress we need to. Oh, there's a question from Frank. Do you think K-12 math might be taught better without textbooks? That's a really interesting question. I think I would love to see more exploration in the curriculum than I currently see. And I mean that both sort of looking nationally as well as looking at my own daughter and what she brings home. Like, you know, I would love to see a math curriculum and a STEM curriculum for elementary school kids that starts off with just noticing things and wondering, right? And getting kids sort of used to the idea that they can ask interesting questions and then they can go investigate them. But it starts with the questions. It doesn't start with what what your teachers want to know. I think that we in STEM fields, especially, maybe math especially, we have a tendency to answer questions for students that they don't yet have. We are much worse at helping students ask interesting questions and then exploring them with them. And so I think that to me is a key distinction. Let's see. How do middle and high school teachers prepare students for college in addition to preparing them to be citizens? I like the ideas you brought up, but it also seems like college curriculum needs to change first. This is a great question. I think especially in mathematics, that there's this symbiosis between high school math and college math. And high school math tends to prepare students for what they sort of anticipate as needing. And we have, when I think about this obsession with calculus, if you are like a high school junior and your life's mission is to really understand French literature or Russian history or any of these topics, a ton of those students are taking calculus, despite the fact that the calculus is not they could benefit from a lot of statistics, they could benefit from a lot of data, they could benefit from quantitative understanding. Calculus is not going to help them understand the fields that they want to go into. They're taking calculus because it's sort of a badge. It's just pure gatekeeping, right? It gives them a badge. They're more likely to get into colleges. And they're right about that. They're more likely to get into elite schools if they have calculus AP with a good score on the AP. And so I think it's really important that colleges have to be part of that discussion, because colleges have a lot of impact on what gets taught in high schools. So it has to be, it's a difficult problem because it spans between two largely separate institutions and two largely separate systems that each one is hard to change. It's hard to change a college curriculum. It's hard to change high school curricula, but changing them both in concert is a really big problem, and it's one that I think we need to tackle. I love the ideas flying by in the chat room with some good names. Dan Finkel does great stuff. My daughter loves to play Prime Climb, which is his great board game.
You've got another question.
Thanks. Would STEM, including physics, if there were less emphasis on algorithmic mathematics by using modern software to manipulate and solve equations? Yeah, I think we need to change what if we changed how we taught math, we would have to do that in concert with STEM fields, right? Because if we want to de-emphasize paper and pencil calculations, then we would have to make sure that students could still succeed in a mechanics class, in a modern physics class, without such great facility, without relying so much on hand calculations. But I think that's important. Anthony asked the question, is my math and social justice only targeted at non-majors? Yeah, it's mostly targeted at non-majors, but occasionally we'll have a STEM major take the class, and it's super fun to have them in there and to have sort of open their eyes about the material that they've been learning, but now they see it from a different perspective. So yeah, occasionally we get STEM majors in there, and that makes it fun. I do projects in my class, and I had a computer science major sort of meld his interest in computer science with the topic of the course. And he made this little game that was attempting to help people understand financial literacy. I love the combination. I love the creativity in that. I know if you all are like most people I know in academia, you're all zoomed out. So I really appreciate that you spent this hour with me. Stephen Jacobs, shoot me an email and I'll send you my address. Thanks. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And as a side note, I'm helping to organize the group that's going to do sea change for math departments, math and computer science, and Alexis is on that effort as well. And I really appreciate all the work that's been done in physics and astronomy in preparation for that. So thanks.